And with that, let me introduce our presenter today, who's going to be speaking about the management of bobwhite quail, and that is Steve Chapman. And Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Good afternoon, everybody. Just to tell you a little bit about myself, I am the forestry coordinator with the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative. I've been with NBCI for a couple of years and worked in the state agency arena with the Georgia Forestry Commission and retired with them several years ago. This presentation is going to be about managing your southern pines for bobwhites. The National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative is the first ever unified multi-state effort to restore bobwhite quail to America's landscape. The NBCI was created by state wildlife agencies comprising the core of the bobwhite range and is funded by these state agencies. The Federal Aid in Wildlife and Sport Fish Recreation Program, the University of Tennessee, Park Cities Quail, and the Joe Crafton Foundation. NBCI is charged with developing and coordinating the implementation of a national habitat-based approach for the landscape scale restoration of huntable populations of wild bobwhites. This is just an example of our sponsors. We don't have all the states, but we do have the regional wildlife agencies that those states all belong to. Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, Wildlife and Sport Fish Restoration, Quail and Upland Game Alliance, Park Cities Quail, and the Joe Crafton Family Endowment for Quail Restoration. The purpose of this presentation is to help forest managers and landowners gain an understanding of how to manage southern pine forests for wild northern bobwhites. And I want to emphasize wild northern bobwhites. For some of you that don't know, bobwhite quail goes by many names, but the formal name is actually northern bobwhite, and that's what we'll probably call it most of the time during this presentation. What are the keys to success for managing for bobwhite quail? And that's good habitat. Most of you probably already know that bobwhite management is not easy, because if it were, we'd have plenty of bees flying across the landscape. This shows the trend of bobwhite decline across its range, including the western range part. This shows things that we don't consider good bobwhite habitat, because modern and agricultural and forestry technologies and societal attitudes have disconnected bobwhites from working lands by erasing habitats. Managing forests and fields with fire has been abandoned. Grazing lands throughout the east have been converted from native clump grass forages to aggressive sod farming exotic grasses such as fescue and Bermuda. Row crop fields are bigger, cleaner, had fewer fence rows and weedy borders. Forest management has become too intensive and not intensive enough, meaning millions of acres of southern forest have been converted into dense pine plantations, and then public sentiments against logging and controlled burning have impeded forest management on millions of acres across the landscape. And the result of this is that across dozens of states, modern land management practices have destroyed habitats for bobwhites and scores of other species across hundreds of millions of acres. And I would also throw in that urbanization has had a lot to do with that also. Bobwhite management is not for everyone. If you're managing your timber to maximize profit, then you don't need to fool yourself about quail management, because it does take some compromises on your profit. And if you're willing to compromise on profit, then by all means consider bobwhite management. And when managing for bobwhites, managing the habitat, it does not guarantee that bobwhites will just appear on the landscape. Just because you build it doesn't mean that they'll come. When you're managing for bobwhites, if you expect to get bobwhites on your property, you need a nearby source of wild bobwhites to colonize new habitats. Small isolated habitats or islands will not attract or sustain those populations. The NBCI Focal Area Program, under the Coordinated Implementation Program, provides guidance to states and partners on how to methodically design and implement successful bobwhite focal areas. Building on lessons learned from the past, CIP establishes design criteria, minimum standards, and protocols, and a centralized data management system to provide complete scientific feedback. NBCI CIP focal areas must have a minimum of 1,500 acres of suitable habitat, comprising of at least 25% of the focal area, and must be paired with an untreated reference area. CIP requires bird goals and habitat objectives, along with monitoring of habitat accomplishment and bird population responses. NBCI anticipates a range-wide array of demonstration area case studies that will result in 10 years and make a compelling case for habitat management and bobwhite restoration. And that 1,500 acres does not have to be on one landowner. It can be over multiple landownerships. What do we need to get good bobwhite? Bobwhites require a vigorous and diverse herbaceous ground cover that includes the following 4 basic components: a mix of native clump grasses for nesting, forbs and legumes, and wildflowers for seed and insect production, scattered clumps of dense, low-growing woody shrubs for protection from weather and predators, and then bare soil underneath that overhead cover, which is necessary for mobility and physical access to seeds on the ground. But bare soil should not be alone by itself. You need that cover overhead. Bare soil without cover is open ground, which increases the chance of predators finding bobwhites. A good rule of thumb is the rule of thirds. Meaning you want to manage the landscape for 1/3 of nesting cover, brood cover, and escape cover. These are essential components to providing usable space for bobwhites, and it must be usable throughout the year. Burning on a 2-year frequency allows for that, and smaller burn units allows for usable space to be readily available with a covey's home range. The rule of thirds: you need grasses, weeds, which includes legumes, flowers, and so forth, and in shrubs, which can be plums, vacciniums, wax myrtles, fire-suppressed oaks, and other hardwoods. The proper distribution and composition, this component of shrubs can provide thermal and escape cover throughout most of the year. If you were a bobwhite quail and you were running around under the ground, this is what your view would be like. In the understory. But what is needed to get these four components into a forested situation? You need sunlight. It's important in the development of bobwhite habitat. If you look at this picture, there's millions of acres of pine stands like this throughout much of the South. In this stand, you'll notice there's no cover or food for bobwhites or much of anything else, unless all they eat is pine seed. In this stand, just imagine what would happen if you're a quail. Predators love it because it's a big kitchen for them. By the looks of diameters of these trees, this stand is ready for a thinning, not only from a wildlife standpoint, but also from a commercial standpoint. The thing to take home in this slide is that there's no cover available for bobwhites. So how do you increase sunlight in the stand? The first thing is through periodic thinnings. And the goal for northern bobwhite management is to maintain pine stands at a basal area between 40 and 70 square feet. Depending on the size of the trees will determine the number of trees that are left per acre. Just take, for example, if you had 14-inch trees and you wanted a basal area of 60 feet, there would be approximately 60 trees per acre. And if you had a stand of 8-inch trees with a basal area of 60, there would be 172 trees per acre. And then frequent fire is also needed. Once a stand is opened up through thinning, frequent fire is important in creating and maintaining the proper dispersion of habitat for bobwhites.
Commercial situation.
And when we're talking about frequent fire,
one is food control.
most of the time we are talking about 2 or 3 year return intervals.
So the more efficient you can make the berry harvesting, how do you pick on your...
And then we also need to consider our regeneration of our forest. Forest regeneration techniques can have a big impact on the habitat. Factors that have an effect on the habitat can be species, spacing of seedlings, and site preparation techniques. And then we also need managed openings if they are included with good forest management. To produce suitable bobwhite habitat, a pine forest needs to be thinned more aggressively than typical commercial forest. Most commercial thinnings aim to reduce pine tree density to a basal area of 70 to 80 square feet per acre. This stand in this picture is around 80 square feet of basal area, which is good spacing for timber management, but not for bobwhites. To meet habitat needs for bobwhite, this stand should be thinned another 30 to 40 square feet, down another 30 to 40 square feet, followed up with prescribed burning. Closed canopy forest and plantations provide poor habitats for bobwhites. And a basic rule of thumb for managing pines for bobwhites is that you need to have, at midday during the summer, when the sun is high in the sky and nearly directly overhead, you need about 60% or more sunlight on the forest floor, which means you would have between 35 and 40% canopy cover. The goal for bobwhite management, like I said earlier, is to maintain pine stands at a basal area of 40 to 70 square feet, with 70 square feet being the trigger point where you need to have a thinning. But this doesn't mean to start thinking about thinning the stand when it reaches 70 square feet. If you wait to start thinking about it by the time the thinning is completed, stands will begin to be shaded out and bobwhite habitat will start to be lost. I got this quote out of Henry Stoddard, who is considered the father of bobwhite quail management. The density of timber stands should receive constant attention on the well-managed quail preserve. So, in other words, multiple thinnings will be needed to conduct and maintain proper stocking for quail. The following pictures are just some examples of pine stands in their state. This is showing a closed canopy and unburned pine stand greater than 120 square feet. And these type of pine stands represent the greatest management need for bobwhites and grassland wildlife across the southeast. It's critically important to couple thinning with frequent burning. Burning this stand would provide little or no benefit due to the overstory canopy, which prevents sunlight from reaching the floor. This picture shows the typical results of a fifth row thinning when timber management is the main objective. There's increased sunlight penetration in the takeout rows, which will be every fifth row, allowing for increased ground cover. But the ground cover inside the rows that were not completely taken out is too thin, which decreases food and cover and increases vulnerability to predation. Burning this stand results in some wildlife benefits, but more sunlight is needed to produce and sustain quality ground cover. A heavy within-row selection of trees will be needed in the next thinning to restore and sustain ground cover. This stand in this picture shows an acceptable timber stocking for deer, turkey, and other habitat generalists. The increased sunlight coupled with frequent burning results in improved ground cover and composition, providing nesting and brooding cover for turkeys and quality forage and fawning cover for deer. Gaps in the ground cover are still predominant, which makes bobwhites vulnerable to predation, especially during the winter months. Ground cover will decrease as the tree canopy quickly closes and reduces sunlight, with the end result being limited value to bobwhites. This photo, which is approximately between 40 and 60 square feet of basal area, has been thinned and burned, exhibits the preferred timber stocking for bobwhites and grassland wildlife. Ample sunlight, as you can see, reaches the forest floor to stimulate desired ground cover, while fuel for frequent prescribed burning is provided by native grasses and pine needle litter. The thinning intensity provides multi-season food and cover, and reduces vulnerability to predation. A 2-year prescribed burn frequency is required for restoration and the maintenance of this pine savanna type. One thing that I want you to know is, as soon as you get finished spinning a stand for bobwhites, it's time to start thinking about the next spinning. You don't need to wait to start planning your thinnings when your stand reaches the trigger point of a basal area of 70 square feet. By the time it takes to plan your harvest and advertise it for sale, and then another, if you give a year on a contract, another year to complete the harvest, by that time the basal area has started to get high enough where the forest floor is beginning to be shaded out, and you'll begin to lose your good understory bobwhite habitat. And the next thing we need is prescribed fire. It's a required component to maintain the understory that is required for managing for bobwhites, pollinators, and numerous other birds and mammals that use this habitat. And the prescribed fire should be frequent. They are essential in pine forests to control hardwood sprouts and encourage desirable native grasses, legumes, forbs, and shrubs used by quail. Land managers should apply fire to a portion of the pine woodlands annually to maintain suitable cover for quail. And I'll follow up with no more than 3 years between your prescribed fires, preferably every 2 years, and that burning more than 3 years will not maintain your quail habitat. Across sites with moderate fertility, prescribed fire should be applied on a 2-year frequency where 50% of the burnable woods are burned each year. On very infertile sites, and especially during drought, a 3-year burn frequency may be sufficient. If you have a 2-year rough that can carry a fire, then you need to burn it. Because if it's left unchecked, hardwood sprouts can quickly shade out desirable plants and could require mechanical or chemical treatments once in the mid or overstory. If you use herbicide, land managers should use those that minimize damage to the desirable native grasses, forbs, and shrubs. This slide shows pictures of some burn plots at Tall Timbers Research Station. These plots were established in 1959 and were placed on a variety of habitats and soil types. These pictures show an example of how different fire frequency intervals had an impact on plant succession. The picture in the upper left-hand corner is an unburned plot that has turned into almost an all-upland hardwood forest, outcompeting anything that might occur in the understory. The picture in the upper right-hand corner has been burned on a 3-year cycle and is coming close to looking like the unburned plot. Controlling the hardwood understory here is probably not going to be done with fire and probably would need some chemical or mechanical help. Some of the findings at Tall Timbers shows that 3-year intervals is an ecological threshold, which means bobwhite habitat and pine savanna will be lost using less frequent burn regimes. Care should be taken to leave desired nesting and escape cover each year of native grass and shrubs from the previous growing season. Generally, prescribed burnets should be less than 50 acres in size as a goal. Adjoining a comparably sized unburned unit such that on the average 50% of the managed pine forest remains unburned each year. Having a mixed smaller unburned and burned units within a stand provides necessary escape cover for bobwhites, and that is very important in following up prescribed burns. They need unburned areas because they are a short distance flyer to reach that cover easily. And burning large unbroken areas at one time leaves large areas with no escape cover for bobwhites. During the traditional late winter and early season spring burn season, land managers should apply fire throughout the season instead of all at once to avoid removing too much cover at once. Prescribed burns should be conducted in late winter through early spring prior to the peak nesting season. It is recommended to mix the timing of burns across burn units to enhance plant diversity. And burning an area over the years at different times can greatly change diversity and structure. It is not recommended for any burning during the late summer or early fall because necessary escape cover, when it is very essential, will be destroyed, especially during the winter during the Cooper's Hawk migration. You can do occasional growing season or lightning season burns during May and June because it's effective at controlling hardwoods, but you wouldn't want to do whole-scale burning during grow season due to damaging bobwhite nests, but it still does provide time for late season nesting. This is a stand of loblolly that is right at a 50 square foot basal area that has been burned with a 2-year frequency and has quality ground cover. It's got shrubs, bunch grasses, and legumes and plants needed for feed. Reforestation. What considerations should you take if interested in managing for bobwhites? There are site preparation issues, which species to plant, and what spacing should seedlings be planted at. Sites can be prepared for regeneration in a variety of ways, ranging from those of low intensity, like prescribed burning, to those of high intensity, like shearing, raking, piling, burning, and or herbicides. The methods used affects plant succession. Prescribed burning and intense mechanical methods, especially when applied during the winter months, seem to produce most desirable food and cover conditions for quail. These techniques result in extensive stands of erect annual weeds, which are important for quail, plants like ragweed, partridge pea, and lespedezas. It also provides brood range, fall and winter food, and escape cover. Herbicides are commonly used for site preparation also, as well as in later in the life of a stand to retard or kill competition. And the impacts of herbicides on quail habitat varies greatly depending on the herbicide or herbicides used and the method of application. In general, you should use selective herbicides that leave lagoons, blackberries, native grasses, and other important quail food, and cover plants should be favored over those that control all vegetation. All pine forest types can be managed to enhance habitat conditions for quail. However, pine species historically indigenous to the site should be used when regenerating pine stands. Within its historic range and on the right site, longleaf pine is best suited for quail management for several reasons. It is better suited over loblolly, shortleaf, or slash because it has a sparse crown, thereby allowing more sunlight to reach the forest floor. It has a long-lived, providing increased management flexibility and a greater percentage of the total stand life in suitable habitat conditions. It has a seed that is nutrient-rich and highly preferred by quail. It is relatively disease-free and insect-resistant, and it's less prone to wind-through and can be burned early in the grass stage. The picture in this slide on the left is a 2-year-old longleaf stand that was mechanically site prepared and machine planted on 12-foot rows. Currently it has good crown cover, but if left alone and without prescribed burning, the stand will grow up and shade everything out. And the picture on the left is a 9-year-old that was burned twice in the last 4 years. This is a planted longleaf stand that has not been burned, has no understory benefit for bobwhites. Starting a burn program in this stand early on, around 1 or 2 years, would have helped to clean the tree stems up from the limbs and open the ground up to sunlight, helping to stimulate the necessary ground cover. Idle openings or managed openings provide brood range, food, and cover for quail, and should be around 15 to 40% in each forest stand that are 2 to 5 acres in size. Rotational winter disking, planting, and burning should be applied to these openings so that 1/3 to 2/3 of each opening remains fallow each year. And herbicides may be needed if exotic grasses or hardwoods invade the site. Roads are also a necessary component in your timber management. They can also be used to manage fallow opening habitat. One thing I would like to emphasize is that managed openings are only important if the entire forest is being managed properly, and openings are not a substitute for good forest management, and they are not islands in unsuitable forest habitat. And this is just a picture of a brood field. And when managing your timber for bobwhites, you need to think about the trade-offs compared to managing timber for economic profit. Where bobwhites are part of the management objective, longer rotations should be favored. So that means they will be normally longer than your typical forest management. And the cost of repeated prescribed burning is high, which can increase your overall cost when managing the stand, and then potential economic loss from not raking pine straw. I want to emphasize that raking pine straw is inconsistent with bobwhite habitat management in most cases. But you can rake straw until the first thin, and that could be an approach to offset any opportunity costs that you may lose carrying your stand out in a longer rotation. And it makes pine savanna management more feasible for some landowners. Raking straw is detrimental to bobwhite habitat management after the first thinning. Another management option is the possibility of setting aside stands within your property and specifically manage those for straw management while managing the rest of the pine, savanna, and bobwhites. And remember that managing for bobwhites is not an easy concept, and it's not an easy practice to do. Everyone always looks at areas like tall timbers in North Florida, the Red Hills around Thomasville, Georgia, and in the Albany areas when it comes to bobwhite management. But due to their unlimited resources, their management intensities, and wild bobwhite populations, their way of management is far beyond the reach of typical southeastern forest management landowners. But there is hope. In the proper landscape and context, southern pine forests can be managed and produce satisfying populations of bobwhites with modest resources and compromises. Some ideas to take home is that quail habitat management is the most difficult, requiring the highest of standards, and that quail habitat management will bring along deer and turkeys, along with numerous other songbirds, pollinators, and other wildlife. But mere deer and turkey management is not necessarily sufficient for bobwhites. Quail habitat is the pinnacle of productive, diverse habitat for a spectrum of species, songbirds, mammals, bees, pollinators, and other things like that. And in closing, remember that quail management is not for everyone, and that 60% or more of the forest floor should be in sunlight. Frequent prescribed burning is required, approximately every 2 to 3 years, depending on where you're at. You need frequent and heavier thinnings to maintain bobwhite habitat, and that desired basal area you want to keep is between 40 and 70 square feet, with 70 being the trigger point for another thinning. And in closing, we need more of the habitat in the picture on the left so we can have more of that, the pictures on the right. And then we also want more of that. And I guess, Robert, here's where we can take questions, I guess.
Yep, this is the point we'll take questions. First of all, Steve, thank you for the presentation and everything. So, folks, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat window, and we'll work through them as they appear in the chat window. So go ahead and type your questions in at this time,
And I think we already have some, Bob. I think I saw some pop up.
We do. We have a couple here. I'm just looking real quick to make sure I haven't missed any of the earlier ones. The first one I see is, what was the ideal rate for thinning? And I think what the next question was, what are you saying is the best basal area?
Well, you would want to thin down for ideal quail habitat management. You want to thin to 40 to 50 basal area. You want to start there, and then as you start approaching 70 square feet, you need to start thinking about a thinning. You don't want it to get over 70, even though it might, due to constraints on getting your timber thinned and so forth. But 70 square feet is the trigger point where you want to thin.
Okay.
Did that answer both those questions?
I believe so. If not, they can. If those didn't answer your questions, please feel free to enter in more clarifying questions for us to respond to. So the next actually is a comment, and you can talk about this. Is the optimum quail habitat management does not seem to be in harmony with forest management. Or should we say timber management?
Repeat that. I was trying to find it.
Yeah. So basically, they're commenting that, you know, when we're managing for quail and we're doing things like thinning down to 40 to 60 square feet of basal area, that
right.
type of management is optimal for raising quail, but it's not optimal for timber management. So if you could comment on that.
Yep. You know, and that's where the landowner's objective has to come into play. If the landowner's all they're interested in is maximizing profit from their timber management, then quail is probably not one of the things that they need to strive for. There are some trade-offs in managing for quail. Carrying your timber stands at thinner densities and longer rotations, so you don't get that income at a quicker rate than you would in managing for quail or timber.
So next question is, how might the management recommendations differ in hardwood forests such as in the Mid-South?
Okay. I'm looking at that question just to get it better in my head. Managing hardwood forest, you still want to maintain a lower basal area. Hardwoods can probably be maintained at about a 30 to 40, or cut down to a 30 to 40 basal area. And then you would want to maintain them at a lower basal area because of their wide spreading crowns, and they can be burned. Maybe not as frequent, but that is a possibility.
Okay, the next question is, what spacing do you recommend for planting loblolly pine?
Usually, you could go probably a 6 by 12 or an 8 by 12 spacing, given that wider row. So early in the age of a stand, you would have the benefit of sunlight reaching the forest floor until the pine shaded it out. and the wider spacing within the rows, say an 8-foot spacing versus a 6-foot spacing, just gives you a few more extra square feet for sunlight to hit the forest floor until that loblolly stand starts to grow together and shade everything out. And then you want to start looking at thinning it, you know, depending on how it's growing, probably 14, 15 years old.
Okay. Is there a recommended basal area specific to oak stands?
There again, just like the hardwood question, I would say 30 to 40 square feet of basal area, or even lower.
Okay. Is there, what about the benefit for planting various food sources for bobwhite? Is there such a thing, and if so, then how? Should it be done in plots, strips, along roadsides or power lines?
That could be part of the managed opening part of your bobwhite, where you want 15 to 30 or 40% of a forested stand in openings. And you can plant plants for bobwhite. But the recommended thing is disking to get natural foods, which bobwhites are going to prefer over planted foods. But you can plant some of those that are already, that would show up naturally.
Okay. So how about thinning heavy in a 5 to 8 chain wide buffer around openings, and then thinning to 60 to 80 square feet of basal area in the rest of the stand?
Nah, I'm thinking about that one. I mean, you would have some benefit thinning that, but then in those stands where they're 60 to 80 basal area, you're going, if you have any quail cover, you're going to start to lose that cover once it gets over 70 square feet. And so the habitat's not there for bobwhites. Plus, you will you open the birds up more to predation because they don't have that ground cover to hide in.
So the next question is, if 10% of the land mass was good quail habitat, would that help?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
So I take it this way. So for example, if I owned 100 acres, and 10% of that 100 acres is 10 acres, would that be helpful to, in other words, I had 10% of my land is suitable for quail habitat, or I manage for quail. Would that be helpful?
I would say no, unless you are in an area where the landscape is better suited for quail habitat. Because you want most of the land, you just like what we're looking at in the for our focal areas, you want 1,500 acres of good quail habitat in that focal area, even though the other might not be at any one time due to burning or other, reforestation efforts, cutting, and so forth.
So a covey of quail takes about 1,500 acres?
Well, you want more than I would say you want more than one covey.
Right.
One covey's probably not going to survive in a habitat like that.
Okay. So how far north can northern bobwhite thrive?
Well, the National Bobwhite Conservation Initiative includes all the southeastern states, all the way to Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, up to Iowa, and northern states, all the way over to New Jersey, and then south. Some of those states are on the verge or have lost all their bobwhite quail, and they have got efforts to translocate bobwhites from other places. New Jersey's doing that right now. They've been translocating quail over the last 3 years from tall timbers, and those bobwhites have survived some of the winters the last 2 or 3 years. Pennsylvania's they have lost all their quail as far as they know, and they're talking about that also.
Okay. So how would you recommend managing a 40-year-old stand at 20 square feet of basal area to promote future quail habitat?
I would, if it's that thinned already, I would burn and control the habitat through prescribed burning. Every 2 or 3 years, burn 50% of the area every 2 to 3 years.
Okay. Would food plots adjacent or between pine areas be successful supplement, and what would you plant?
Yes, they would be a supplement if you have good pine forest or good forest management.
Okay. And do you have any recommendations on what you would plant?
I would have to find out for that.
Okay.
Bob, have we lost the webinar?
No, we haven't. I just pushed out the survey.
Okay.
So, folks, you'll see that your browser probably has opened up with the survey. It may be behind your Collaborate window, but if it hasn't opened up yet, give it a minute to do that. So do loggers or timber buyers resist the frequent logging, resist by discounting what they will pay for stumpage when logging to a lower basal area rate, such as after the first thinning?
If I have had some thinnings on my own, if they can get a load to a load and a half acre of wood, you're going to get here in my area, and I can only speak for my area. I can't speak for the rest of the southeast. But if they can get a load to a load and a half of wood on per acre, usually the prices will run about the same. And if you get it to 70 or 80 basal area and thin it down to 40, you know, I've noticed that that's what you're going to run, is about a load and a half to the acre here. I can't speak for anywhere else.
Okay. Is there a good way to plant wiregrass seed?
I'm gonna have to defer on that. I'll have to find if they can send me an email, I can find that answer for them. But I'm not a wiregrass expert.
Okay. And at this time, I think that's the end of our questions. So, here's one more. What impacts are you seeing on bobwhite populations related to the spread of fire ant and high feral hog population?
Again, I'll have to find out an answer for that. If they want to email me,